So if we talk about a policy mismatch, is this because central banks are communicating things wrong, or is it because they're panicking because they're seeing 5-6% inflation, which frankly is still staying on much longer than we thought last year?
I think there is a little bit of a race going on. Markets are pricing in new expectations. Central banks don't want to be seen to be not responding to this very high inflation, which is linked to the restart, and so they're responding. The rhetoric ratchets up, the market responds. So there's a bit of a race going on, a feedback loop. And I think eventually, things will settle. People will start to see through it. But at the moment, I would expect this to continue for a while. And we're going to see volatility. At the end of the day, I think we're going to see a muted full cycle of interest rate rises.
Would that be genius? Because actually, so you have central banks that at the moment seem quite hawkish. They end up being dovish, and so it's almost like they don't do much, but mission accomplished.
Well, we should think about why the cycle will be more muted, in my view, and I think that has to do with the nature of the inflation here. Right. Very few people really mention this is not an overheating economy. We're still growing below potential. So the idea here is these are inflation dynamics, very unpleasant, not acceptable in many ways, but they are driven by supply constraints, not by an overheating economy, and that will lead to a more muted cycle in the end. But until we get there, we're going to see a lot of volatility.
But I think a lot of economists are saying, look, I go to the supermarket and my tomatoes are whatever, €1.40 instead of €1. Even when the supply constraint eases, then that's not going to go back to 1.
I think that's right. I think we are going to see a higher inflation regime in a steady state than what we've seen in the last 20 years. And central banks will ultimately have to live with this higher inflation, because if they want to squeeze it all out and get back to what we had before in terms of the inflation rate, I think the cost to the real economy will be too great, because this is not driven by an overheating economy, but by supply constraints.
I also spoke to Jeff Curry of Goldman Sachs, and he was punchy. He said, look, I've never seen a market like this in my 30 years in the markets, and we're out of everything, right? You name it, and we're out of it. When do these supply concerns go back on track to something that's much more easy to live with?
I think the good news is I'm here today for the first time in almost 2 years. We're reopening. The quicker we can reopen the economies while paying attention to the health and safety concerns, I think the faster this will happen. My guess is we're not really going to see an easing on this before the third quarter, but I would be hopeful that if we can continue on the opening path, on the reopening path, that by the end of the year we're going to start to see some of these supply chains that will begin to adapt. Some of it will remain in place. Remember, we're going to have the transition to net zero. That's going to raise costs. That's going to create some of the same mismatches. We're going to have higher energy prices for a while. We're going to have a rebuilding of global supply chains generally to have them be more resilient. So some of these longer-term factors will persist, and that's why I think we're going to have to live with higher inflation going forward.